The darkness had descended upon Henry Hospital in room 208, where a miraculous story was unfolding in silence. 10-year-old Brenna Robinson was silently battling a fate that seemed unchangeable. The heart monitor intermittently beeps with increasingly faint beats. Helen and William, her parents, sat by her bedside, unable to hold back their tears. Brenna's pale figure, closed eyes and labored breaths struck a blow that left them utterly lost. Beside her, Albert, her loyal foal, never left her side. He stood at the edge of the bed, head bowed, his eyes filled with worry as if trying to shield her from some invisible force. Each passing minute seemed to compress the air in the room into an unbearable silence of despair. Hours earlier, Dr. Matthew White had entered the room with a grave expression. "I'm very sorry," he said, his voice laden with sadness, breaking the stillness. "There's nothing more we can do. Brenna's heart is too weak." His words tore through the air, leaving Helen and William stunned. They had known time was running out, but hearing the final verdict was agonizing. "We've tried everything," the doctor continued, his voice lowering. "Now, all that's left is waiting." The room became a prison of despair, where every second overflowed with tears and vacant stares. Albert, the foal who never left her side, paced back and forth as if waiting for something. Suddenly he stopped, his ears standing upright. The foal turned toward the window, where moonlight pierced the glass with an unusual intensity, as though sensing something beyond human perception. A soft breeze passed through, bringing a subtle change in the air, and when Albert turned back to look at William, his eyes seemed to carry a message beyond human understanding. William glanced at Albert, then at Helen. "I think we're just exhausted," he said, his voice low, trying to mask the fear in his heart. Helen didn't respond. She simply squeezed her husband's hand. Yet deep inside her, a fragile glimmer of hope began to rise. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Helen noticed the unease in Albert's eyes. He looked at William, his gaze a mixture of hope and despair. Suddenly, Brenna's heart monitor started to beep irregularly. The alarming sound echoed through the room, prompting Helen to scream, "Doctor, please come quickly!" The medical team rushed in, chaos taking over the space. Dr. White adjusted the equipment while nurses worked frantically to stabilize Brenna amidst the turmoil. Albert pressed his body against Brenna's, unwavering. "Get the foal out of here," Dr. White ordered, his face tense with frustration. "No," Helen pleaded, her hands trembling. "Let him stay, please." Despite having exhausted all options, the doctor hesitated but eventually relented. "Fine, but if anything goes wrong—" He trailed off, his eyes filled with worry. "Nothing will go wrong," Helen replied, her voice shaking but resolute. Albert lay next to Brenna, his breaths deep and calm, seemingly comforting her as if an invisible bond between the two provided her with protection and love. Minutes later, a miracle happened. Brenna's heart monitor began to stabilize. She slowly opened her eyes for the first time in days. The faint light of the night made her blink as though what she had endured was merely a long dream. In a weak and almost whispered voice, Brenna said, "Albert, you never left me." These words, like the voice of an angel, filled the room with silence, and Helen's tears turned into sobs. William gripped his daughter's hand tightly, while Dr. White stood motionless, skeptical of what he had just witnessed. Albert looked at Brenna with eyes full of love, as though he understood everything. The room remained silent, broken only by the sound of breaths and Brenna's faint heartbeat. William could hardly believe his eyes. "How is this possible?" he murmured. "It's impossible." Dr. White, after a long moment of silence, finally spoke. "This is beyond explanation." He looked at Albert, then back at Helen and William. "Perhaps there are things science simply cannot explain." Helen smiled through her tears, her eyes shining. "I think it was his love that made this miracle happen." William looked at his daughter, who raised her head and offered a weak but warm smile. Helen cupped her daughter's face, her tears flowing uncontrollably. "You've come back to us, Brenna," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Her heart overflowed with joy and gratitude. Through the seemingly endless days of despair in the hospital, Helen had never dared to hope that her daughter might wake up. But now, though still frail, Brenna had opened her eyes, and it seemed as if new rays of hope were dawning. "Doctor." White stood nearby, his eyes betraying his astonishment. He surveyed the scene, disbelief etched on his face. "I don't know what just happened, but Brenna is responding." "We'll monitor her condition closely," he said, carefully choosing his words as though struggling to believe what he had witnessed. A seasoned professional, even he could not rationalize the miracle unfolding before his eyes. When the doctor and nurses focused on Brenna, something strange happened to Albert. The foal, usually full of energy, now seemed exhausted, as if bearing an enormous burden. Albert climbed down from the bed and lay on the floor, his eyes never leaving the little girl. The foal's eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now filled with worry. Helen immediately noticed the change, her heart tightening as she saw Albert, Brenna's loyal companion, lying there weakly, as though carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Helen quickly approached, gently stroking Albert's head. "You saved Brenna." "Albert, you're our angel," she said, her voice full of gratitude, unable to fully express her feelings. Her words were both a thank you and an acknowledgement of everything Albert had done for her family. Although Brenna's sudden recovery kept the atmosphere tense, Dr. White ordered immediate tests to better understand her condition. The nurses began moving equipment around the girl, who remained conscious but silent. Helen and William were asked to wait outside, but neither of them wanted to leave the room. They both felt their presence was essential and couldn't bear to leave Brenna alone at that moment. Something inside them told them Brenna needed them more than ever, and Albert, her loyal foal, seemed to sense the same. Meanwhile, William suddenly recalled a story he had read years ago. He glanced at Helen, hesitating a little, then asked, "Have you ever heard of animals healing humans? Even without scientific evidence, I can't help but think of it." Helen shook her head but held Brenna's hand tightly. She had never heard of such a thing, but her heart couldn't deny the feeling that there was a magical connection between her daughter and Albert. William looked at the foal lying near Brenna, its eyes still bright even though its body was exhausted. "It could be a coincidence," William said, trying to rationalize, "but I can't help but think Albert did something extraordinary." Helen remained silent, unsure of what to say. But deep down she felt something profound, love and loyalty beyond explanation. Brenna, though weak, gradually felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. The pain had subsided, replaced by a gentle, calm feeling. Although the medical devices indicated her condition was stable, an air of mystery lingered. Had Albert's love saved Brenna? Or was there something deeper, inexplicable happening between them? In the hours that followed Brenna's recovery, silence and tension filled the room, and endless questions arose. Although her condition had stabilized, the medical team couldn't explain the sudden improvement. "We've done everything we could, Doctor," White sighed, "but I've never seen anything like this. There's nothing in the tests to suggest Brenna recovered naturally. Everything is so strange." Dr. White, known for his skepticism and faith in science, spent hours reviewing the initial test results. But nothing could explain the miraculous change in Brenna's condition. Both the doctor and nurses were baffled by what they witnessed, but none of them could deny that Brenna had crossed a threshold between life and death, and this couldn't be a mere coincidence. In the hospital room, Albert remained alert, though his energy had visibly waned. The foal, usually cheerful and lively, now seemed a shadow of its former self. He lay silently beside Brenna, his eyes fixed on her, as if unwilling to leave. Something about the foal's behavior made William feel that Albert had sacrificed a part of his strength to save Brenna. William couldn't take his eyes off Albert and recalled a story his grandfather had told him as a child about horses sharing their vitality with those they loved. Though this was an ancient belief without scientific basis, the sight of Albert beside Brenna made him unable to dismiss the thought. "Do you think Albert did something special?" William asked, his voice filled with both doubt and wonder. Helen looked at Albert for a long moment, then turned back to William. "I don't know," she said, "but I feel something. We may not understand it, but we can feel its love and sacrifice." Both of them gazed at the foal, whose eyes remained fixed on Brenna. At that moment, the whole family felt that a miracle had occurred, not just in Brenna's body but in their hearts. Albert's inexplicable love and loyalty had transcended the boundaries of what science could explain, leaving a profound legacy in their lives. Brenna opened his eyes again, this time more alert. A faint smile appeared on his lips as he looked at Albert. "He's been with me all this time," Brenna whispered, his voice soft but carrying a strength that made Helen and William exchange surprised glances. "What do you mean, darling?" Helen asked, sitting closer to Brenna. Brenna looked at his mother, his eyes appearing deeper as he continued. "When I felt like I was in a dark place, I heard Albert's voice calling me. It wasn't just him. I felt someone wanted me to stay, as if I needed not to leave." Brenna's words filled the room with a heavy yet emotional atmosphere. William swallowed hard, struggling to process what his child had just said. How could a horse be present wherever Brenna had been, he wondered. Albert now appeared to be sound asleep on the floor next to the bed, but his ears were slightly perked up, as if still alert. That night, when the hospital finally fell quiet, Helen sat by Brenna's side while William stepped out to get coffee. At that moment, Brenna said something that made Helen's heart skip a beat. "Mom, when I was in that dark place, I heard a voice like Albert's calling me. But it wasn't just him. I felt like someone wanted me to stay, as if I needed not to leave." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. She couldn't respond immediately, her thoughts swirling around the frightening yet comforting idea that something beyond what the eye could see was at work, as if a force had acted through Albert to save Brenna. As she held her daughter's hand and watched him fall asleep again, a question echoed in her mind. What does Albert know that we don't? The next morning, the hospital room was still wrapped in an odd tranquility. Brenna was still asleep, but his breathing was calm and peaceful, something Helen hadn't seen in weeks. William sat on a chair nearby, his gaze fixed on Albert, the little horse still lying in the same spot. Helen noticed and whispered to William, "Have you noticed? He hasn't left Brenna's side for even a second. He hasn't eaten anything since yesterday." William nodded, but something seemed to trouble him. He moved closer to Albert, gently stroking the foal's reddish-brown coat. Albert didn't react immediately. He just lifted his tired eyes and let out a sigh. There was sadness in those eyes, mixed with something William couldn't describe. "It's like he understands something we humans cannot," William murmured, almost to himself. When Brenna stirred on the bed and saw Albert lying beside him, he reached out and touched the foal. Helen immediately assisted, her eyes glued to the miraculous scene. Brenna sat up, still frail, but determined. "I need him, Mom. He's the reason I'm here," the child said, his voice weak but firm enough to render Helen speechless. The moment was interrupted when Dr. White entered the room, holding a clipboard with a mix of relief and confusion on his face. Brenna's test results were normal, but it didn't make sense. There were no signs suggesting he could recover this quickly. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, looking at William and Helen, hesitating before continuing. "Have you noticed anything unusual?" William and Helen exchanged glances, unsure how to explain what was happening without sounding absurd. After all, who would believe that the bond between a child and his foal could hold the key to such a miracle? "All we know is that Albert hasn't left his side," Helen replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Perhaps that was why Dr. White looked at Albert as if considering an impossible possibility. He knew he couldn't base his conclusions on anything other than science, yet the intensity in the horse's gaze made him pause. "We'll continue monitoring Brenna, but I must say this case is unique." As the doctor left, William walked to the window, searching for answers in the gray scenery outside. He knew something extraordinary was happening, something that defied all rational explanations. And as he looked at Albert, the foal now appearing even more exhausted, he felt a wave of guilt for being unable to ease the burden the young horse seemed to carry. One thing was certain. While Albert was playing a role no one could explain, what drove him, what he knew, and more importantly, how far he would go for Brenna remained a mystery. Albert stayed by Brenna's side, his eyes now dull and his strength visibly waning with each passing hour. Helen felt her heartache as she watched the foal, who seemed to be losing something vital, yet his determination to protect Brenna remained unwavering. William began noticing small changes in the horse's behavior. He no longer responded to surrounding sounds and didn't even lift his head when called. It was as if his very existence was being drained away. Brenna, however, showed an improvement no one could explain. That afternoon she asked to sit at the edge of the bed, her previously frail voice sounding stronger. "Mom, I need Albert to stay with me even if he's tired," Brenna said softly, holding tightly to the horse's reins. Helen tried to hide the worry on her face, but Albert's fragility was unmistakable. How could she deny her daughter, especially when Brenna seemed to be returning to life after such a nightmare? William, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond comprehension had occurred during the night. He woke up and walked down the hospital hallway, gazing at the sky through the window. The stars shone brightly, yet there was an unsettling quality to the scene. "How is this possible?" he muttered to himself. "Why does it feel like Albert is giving a part of himself to Brenna?" When he returned to the room, he saw Helen sitting by Brenna, who was peacefully asleep. Albert remained as always, lying motionless on the floor, his eyes fixed on the girl as though standing guard. The silence in the room was broken only by the gentle sound of Brenna's breathing. William felt a lump rise in his throat as he approached the horse. Kneeling beside Albert, he placed a hand on its head and whispered, "You're doing something none of us can understand, aren't you? But at what cost?" The next morning, Dr. White returned with more test results, his disbelief evident as he stated there was no way to explain what was happening. Brenna wasn't just stable. She was showing signs of complete recovery. If her condition continued to improve, she could be discharged in a matter of days. Dr. White looked at the parents with a mixture of joy and confusion. "But I have to ask, has there been any intervention we were unaware of?" William and Helen hesitated. How could they explain that the heartbeat filling the room wasn't Brenna's but Albert's? The horse seemed to be silently fighting for its owner in a sacrifice no one knew the extent of. What no one could ignore was that every step Brenna took toward life seemed to drain Albert's vitality. Overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, William stepped out into the hallway once more, this time with tears streaming down his face. Something was about to happen, something no one could stop. The quiet night in the hospital was heavy with the stillness of the late hours. Brenna slept peacefully as if nothing could disturb her serenity. She lay in the hospital bed, her breathing steady, her face still bearing traces of the exhaustion from her long fight against illness. Meanwhile, Albert, the family's beloved horse, was growing weaker. It lay beside Brenna's bed, its body slumped on the floor, its eyes no longer as bright as before. Its strength seemed to be fading, as though its unconditional sacrifice had drained all its remaining life. Helen stood by the hospital bed, looking at Albert with a heavy heart, her face pale with worry. She didn't want to admit what she feared the most, but deep down she knew that Albert had sacrificed itself to save her daughter. Throughout the long days, Albert had always been Brenna's protector and loyal companion. Even so, Helen couldn't stop worrying about the future. She loved Albert as a family member, and their sacrifice left her at a loss for words to describe her feelings. William stood near the window, gazing at the full moon illuminating the room. The silvery light added to the night's stillness. He felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for Albert's unwavering effort to save Brenna, and guilt because he couldn't do more to save the horse. Looking at Albert's weary figure, William felt a sharp pang of sorrow. He knew the horse didn't have much time left, and he didn't know how to face that reality. Brenna slowly awakened, opening her eyes to look directly at her parents. Her voice was faint, but carried the determination of a strong spirit. "Mom, Dad, he's tired, but I know he helped me. He saved me," she said, her eyes full of gratitude and love for Albert. Helen gently stroked the horse's head, tears streaming down her face. "You're our hero, Albert. But now we need to take care of you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The love she felt for the horse was indescribable. William tried to stay strong to encourage the family. "Brenna, we'll do everything we can for him. He'll be okay." Yet deep down, he wasn't sure. Brenna slowly shook her head, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. "He protected me when I was in that dark place. Now he needs to rest." Brenna's words hit William like a wave crashing over him, forcing him to confront a painful truth he wasn't ready to accept. William decided to step outside the hospital, seeking a moment of clarity under the silver moonlight. He felt exhausted, not just physically but also emotionally. What had happened to his family seemed like an insurmountable challenge. But as he stepped outside, he sensed a presence beside him, and when he turned, he realized it was Albert. The young horse, though exhausted, had found the strength to follow him outside, its weary eyes still full of purpose. Albert gazed at William intently, as though it wanted to say something it could not express in words. William knelt and gently held Albert's face, his hands trembling with emotion. Tears streamed down his face. "Are you trying to tell me something?" he whispered, unable to contain his feelings. "But why does it feel like you're saying goodbye?" Albert softly licked his hand, as if to comfort him, then slowly lay down on the grass. Though drained, Albert's expression gave William an odd sense of peace, as if the horse was trying to communicate something beyond comprehension. William could feel Albert's sacrifice but couldn't fully grasp what the horse wanted to convey. Inside the hospital, Helen noticed the sorrowful look on William's face. "What happened?" she asked worriedly, stepping closer to her husband. "He's showing us that all of this has a purpose," William replied, struggling to stay composed. "But I think we need to prepare for what's coming next." His words were heavy with concern, and Helen felt a rising fear within her. Once again, Albert's presence brought questions without answers. "How far is he willing to go?" Helen asked, uncertain of what to do next. The next morning, Brenna quietly entered room 208, but the tension lingered. She had been awake, unable to sleep any longer after seeing Albert lying motionless beside the bed. Albert's chest rose and fell slowly as though each breath was a tremendous effort. Helen adjusted her daughter's pillow but couldn't take her eyes off the horse. She knew something was gravely wrong but lacked the courage to admit it. A sense of unease consumed her, leaving her unable to think of anything other than Albert's life hanging in the balance. William walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee, pausing for a moment to observe the scene. Brenna was holding Albert's lead rope, while Helen gently stroked the horse's reddish-brown coat. The room was filled with a silent connection, as though unspoken emotions were understood among them. William approached, handing one of the cups to Helen. "He's not awake yet?" he asked softly, trying to maintain composure in this tense situation. Helen shook her head. "He won't leave Brenna, almost as if he's forcing himself to stay here even though it's taking everything out of him." Helen's words made William's heart ache. He understood, but how could they help Albert when it seemed too late? Brenna looked at her parents, her voice gentle but determined. "Mom, Dad, we need to help Albert. He helped me when no one else could. Now it's our turn." William felt a pang in his chest as he heard those words. He knew Brenna was right, but how could they help a horse seemingly giving up its life out of love? As he searched for an answer, Brenna added, "I feel like he needs us now more than ever." Her words were a reminder of Albert's unconditional sacrifice for their family. Later that day, Dr. White entered the room with a mix of relief and curiosity. "Brenna is recovering remarkably. If this continues, we could discharge her in a few days," he said, trying to mask his skepticism. William, however, couldn't fully embrace the news. "What about Albert?" he asked, gesturing toward the horse beside the bed. Dr. White frowned, glancing at Albert. "He looks exhausted, possibly from stress. Animals can be very sensitive to human emotions, but beyond that, I don't see anything obvious. You might want to have a vet check on him just to be sure." After the doctor left, William and Helen decided to take action. They called a local veterinarian to the hospital that afternoon. The vet, a kind woman named Rosie, carefully examined Albert. "He's very tired, but I don't see any signs of physical illness," she said gently, stroking the horse. "It's as though he's emotionally drained. Did you mention he's very attached to Brenna?" William nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "He hasn't left Brenna's side since all of this started, almost like he's been protecting our daughter from something." Rosie looked at the horse with a knowing expression. Horses form incredibly strong bonds with their humans. Sometimes they give of themselves in ways we as people don't fully understand. Albert seems to be carrying the weight of something only he can sense. The night descended upon the hospital, bringing an unusual serenity to room 208. Brenna sat comfortably on her bed, gazing at the small horse beside her with eyes full of emotion. The little horse was still there, but its energy seemed to have faded. Its breaths were slow and heavy, and the light in its eyes was dimming. Helen sat beside her daughter, gently holding her hand, while William stood by the window, his hands in his pockets. "Mom, I know the little horse is tired," Brenna said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "He's still here because of me, but I feel like he's trying too hard." Helen took a deep breath, fighting back tears. She knew Brenna was right, but the thought of losing the little horse was too painful. It was strong. Its mother's love had done everything for it, and somehow it was still protecting Brenna. William slowly turned to look at the scene, bearing a weight that seemed unbearable. He approached the bed, crouched beside Brenna, and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "The little horse has given everything it could to save you. Maybe it's time for it to rest. It did this because it loves you, but now it needs us to take care of it." William's words echoed in the silence of the room. Brenna looked at her father, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Dad, but I want you to know that I will never forget what he did for me. Never." In the quiet of the night, the room was enveloped in an almost supernatural peace. The monitor beside Brenna continued to emit rhythmic signals, indicating her stabilized condition. However, by the little horse's bedside, the scene was different. Its breathing was even slower, and it could barely open its eyes. When it did, for a fleeting moment, it looked directly at Brenna as if conveying a silent message. Finally, William noticed the change and knelt beside the little horse, gently stroking its head. "You did something none of us can truly understand. You gave everything to Brenna. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of our family." The sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange. When Brenna awoke, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. She looked around the room and saw the little horse still beside her, its head resting on her leg. At last, the little horse had found peace. Helen approached Brenna, wrapping her arms tightly around her. William, with tears streaming down his cheeks, placed his hand on their shoulders, forming a silent bond between them. They knew the little horse had passed, but its presence was still strongly felt in the room. As the morning light filled the room with peculiar tranquility, They understood that the little horse hadn't just saved Brenna. It had left an eternal lesson about unconditional love. Love has the power to transform lives and endure even when the body is no longer present. Room 208 was bathed in the gentle glow of morning light, with an unusual serenity. Brenna held the little horse's leash, her eyes gazing out the window. The room felt empty but carried something no one could explain. Helen and William sat beside their daughter, feeling the weight of loss, but also the strength of what the little horse had done. When Dr. White entered with the test results, his expression reflected confusion. "Brenna isn't just recovering. She's stronger than we expected. This doesn't make sense." He looked at Brenna's parents, hesitant. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Helen took a deep breath before responding. "It's love. The little horse gave everything for our daughter." The doctor simply nodded, speechless, and left, leaving behind a sense of mystery that no one could explain. Later that day, Brenna wanted to take a walk in the hospital garden, with her parents' help. She slowly made her way to a bench under a tree, then suddenly stopped and pointed at the empty lawn ahead. "He's here," Brenna said. William looked at Helen, hesitant to speak about the little horse. "He asked, but I didn't know how to answer." Brenna smiled faintly, saying he was fine and would always watch over them. Her parents exchanged tearful glances, feeling something beyond their understanding. Back in the room, Brenna began to draw. The result left Helen speechless, a portrait of the little horse beside a glowing lamp, as if it were protecting the family. "He wants us to know he's happy." Brenna explained that the drawing would be hung on the wall as a reminder of the little horse's sacrifice and unconditional love. That night, Brenna slept peacefully while Helen and William sat beside her, feeling the absence yet also the enduring strength of the love the little horse had left behind. William broke the silence. "Albert showed us what true love is." Helen nodded, holding her husband's hand. They knew that although Albert was gone, he remained present in every moment that bound their family together uniquely and eternally. The days in the hospital came to an end as Brenna was finally discharged. The medical team celebrated her departure, still marveling at her recovery, which defied all explanations. William carried his daughter's backpack, while Helen held his hand, helping him slowly make his way to the car. In Brenna's bag, Albert's leash remained like a talisman, a symbol of the love that had brought him home. Albert's absence was unmistakable. The pony's bed still sat in the corner of the room, and its toys lay scattered around as if constantly reminding the family of its loyalty. Brenna did not appear sad. She had spent the afternoon sketching an image of the pony running across a green field under a clear blue sky. She was content. "Now," Brenna said with a serene smile, "he wants us to be happy too." William looked at his daughter, feeling something stir within him. Inspired by everything the pony had done, he proposed something new to the family. "What if we help other animals the way the pony helped us? We could do it to honor him." Helen smiled warmly at the idea. "I think he would love that." From that day on, the family began visiting animal shelters to care for abandoned ponies and find homes for them. Brenna, still in the process of healing, eagerly participated, always sharing the pony's story with anyone willing to listen. Every act of kindness seemed to strengthen the invisible bond they still felt with the pony. As time passed, the memory of the pony lived on, not just in the hearts of Brenna, Helen, and William, but in the lives of countless animals touched by his legacy. They came to understand that the love they received never truly vanished. It simply transformed into something even greater. Thus, the pony's journey continued, not just as a memory but as a source of inspiration for the family and everyone around them, spreading the unconditional love he had shown. The story concludes, but its lessons of love, sacrifice, and gratitude continue to resonate. In life, some moments make us realize the true value of the simple things around us. Albert taught us that, without the need for words, Love and loyalty can transcend even the boundaries of life itself. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey. Remember to cherish the precious relationships in your life, for sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest meaning. See you in the next story.